The Christmas decorations swayed gently from the rearview mirror as the silver sedan carved through the darkening forest road. Red and gold tinsel caught the last fragments of sunlight filtering through the dense canopy of acacia and mahogany trees. In the back seat, Margaret Holloway sat with her hands folded in her lap, her fingers worrying the edge of a faded cloth bag that contained everything she'd been allowed to bring. "Almost there, Mama," her daughter-in-law Jennifer said from the passenger seat, her voice bright with false cheerfulness. "The sisters said the retreat is very peaceful. Perfect for Christmas prayers." Margaret nodded slowly, her weathered face turned toward the window. She was 73 years old, thin as a reed, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a plain blue dress that had been mended twice at the hem and shoes that were clean but worn at the heels. To anyone who looked at her, she was exactly what her family believed her to be, a poor, tired old woman who had outlived her usefulness. Her son David drove in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road. Beside Margaret sat her younger son Peter, scrolling through his phone with barely concealed impatience. In the very back, squeezed between Christmas gift bags that would never reach her, sat David's teenage daughter Clara, earbuds in, deliberately looking anywhere but at her grandmother. The car smelled of new leather and expensive perfume, Jennifer's perfume. Jennifer, who had redecorated Margaret's old bedroom the week after Margaret moved into the cottage behind the main house. The cottage that had no heat and a door that didn't lock properly. Margaret had said nothing then. She said nothing now. She had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power. "This retreat," Margaret finally spoke, her voice soft and measured. "The sisters who run it, have you met them?" A pause. "Too long." "Of course, Mama," Jennifer recovered. "Very holy women. They're expecting you." Margaret's fingers tightened on her bag. Inside were three things: a change of clothes, her reading glasses, and a small wooden cross her late husband Samuel had carved for her 40 years ago. She didn't need to feel for them to know they were there. What she didn't bring, because she'd learned to hide it well, was the mobile phone taped beneath the bathroom sink in the cottage. Or the documents locked in a safety deposit box under a name her children had never heard. Or the truth that would have stopped this car in its tracks if any of them had known it. The road grew darker. The trees pressed closer. "How long will I be there?" Margaret asked. "As long as you need, Mama," David said, his first words in an hour. "To pray. To rest. To find peace." Margaret heard what he didn't say, to stop being our responsibility. She closed her eyes and remembered another Christmas, decades ago, when these same children had fought over who would sit in her lap to open presents. When David had called her his hero for working 3 jobs after their father died. When Peter had wept into her shoulder the night he failed his exams, and she'd promised him everything would be fine. She had kept that promise. She had made everything fine. They just didn't know how. The car stopped in a clearing where the forest road ended in a circle of trampled grass. No building. No retreat. No sisters in habits waiting with warm smiles. Just trees and gathering darkness and the sudden, terrible silence of the engine cutting off. "We're here," David said. Margaret didn't move. Her heart, that faithful muscle that had carried her through poverty and widowhood and betrayal, began to beat with the slow, heavy rhythm of understanding. "There's no retreat here," she said quietly. Jennifer turned in her seat, and for just a moment, Margaret saw something flicker across her daughter-in-law's face. Not quite guilt. Not quite cruelty. Something in between, the look of someone who had convinced themselves that a terrible thing was actually a necessary thing. "Mama," Jennifer began, then stopped. She looked at David. David stared straight ahead at the dark wall of trees. "You've been unhappy with us for a long time. You said so yourself." "I never." "You did," Peter interrupted, looking up from his phone. "Last month. You said you felt like a burden." Margaret remembered. She had said it once, late at night, when the pain in her hip had kept her awake and she'd made the mistake of asking Peter to help her to the bathroom. He'd sighed so heavily, as if her aging body was a personal insult. "I meant," Margaret started. "We know what you meant," Jennifer said, and now her voice was gentle, so gentle it was worse than anger. "You're tired, Mama. You're ready to go be with Samuel. You've said that too." "I said I missed him, not that I—" "It's Christmas Eve," David said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were his father's eyes, but where Samuel's had been warm, David's were cold. The best night to meet God, don't you think? Peaceful. Holy. The words hung in the air like frost. Clara pulled out her earbuds. Dad, are we actually? Clara, stay in the car, Jennifer snapped. Margaret understood then. Fully. Completely. In the way that doesn't come from words but from the sudden absence of them. From the way Peter was already opening his door. From the way Jennifer had positioned herself so Margaret couldn't easily climb over her. From the way David had parked facing outward, ready for a quick departure. Her own children. On Christmas Eve. If your own family betrayed you like this, could you survive it? Comment survive or broken. Get out, Mama, Peter said, not unkindly. That was somehow worse, the casualness of it, as if they were dropping her at church instead of abandoning her to death. Margaret's hands shook as she gathered her bag. Please, she whispered. Please don't do this. You already signed everything over to us, Jennifer said, and there it was, the truth beneath the lies. The cottage deed. The small savings account. That old jewelry. It's all transferred. You made sure we'd be taken care of. I never signed. You did, Mama, David said firmly. 2 months ago. Don't you remember? You were so confused that day. Margaret did remember that day. She remembered being given pills for her headache, and then papers appearing in front of her while she struggled to focus. She remembered Jennifer's hand guiding hers. She remembered waking up hours later with no memory of what she'd signed. She had said nothing then because she'd been gathering evidence. Documentation. Phone records. Because Margaret Holloway had learned 40 years ago, when Samuel's brother tried to steal their business, that proof was more powerful than accusations. But she'd never imagined she'd need proof against her own children. The cold will be peaceful, Jennifer continued. Like falling asleep. The sisters say. There are no sisters. Margaret's voice broke. Stop pretending there are sisters. Silence. Then David, quietly, Get out of the car, Mama. Peter opened Margaret's door. The December air rushed in, sharp with the promise of a cold night. In this part of the forest, in these mountains north of the city, temperatures would drop below freezing after sunset. Margaret had maybe 3 hours. She stepped out on shaking legs, clutching her bag. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss. Through the trees, she could hear the distant sound of water, a stream, maybe, or a small waterfall. She turned back to the car. Please. I raised you. I loved you. We love you too, Mama, Jennifer said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. That's why we're doing this. You'll be with Dad now. You'll be happy. I'm not ready to. But David was already in the car. Peter climbed in beside Clara, who was crying silently, her young face pressed against the window. For a moment, Margaret and Clara locked eyes. Help me, Margaret's expression pleaded. Clara looked away. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Red taillights flared in the dusk. And then they were gone. Margaret stood in the clearing until she could no longer hear the car. Until the forest sounds, birds settling, insects chirping, leaves rustling, slowly returned. Until her legs stopped shaking enough for her to think. She was not crying. She would not cry. Samuel had taught her that. Margaret, he told her once, when his own brother had tried to forge documents to claim Samuel's late father's land, tears are for after the battle, not during it. During it, you think. So Margaret thought. She assessed, elderly body, moderate fitness for her age from years of walking everywhere because she couldn't afford taxis. Hip pain, manageable. Vision good with her glasses. Mental clarity excellent despite what her family believed. She inventoried, cloth bag with 1 change of clothes, reading glasses, wooden cross. No phone, that was still hidden in the cottage. No food. No water bottle. No medication. She observed, forest, dense. Temperature dropping. No visible trail except the road her family had driven down. No sounds of civilization except the distant rushing water. She had maybe 3 hours before hypothermia became a real risk. But Margaret Holloway had not survived 73 years of poverty, widowhood, betrayal, and deliberate obscurity by giving up easily. She opened her bag and put on the second dress over the first, layers for warmth. She wrapped the cloth bag around her shoulders like a shawl. She touched the wooden cross and whispered, "Help me think, Samuel." Then she started walking, not down the road where her family had gone, but toward the sound of water. Because Margaret remembered something her children had forgotten. 42 years ago, when Samuel was still alive and they were still building their small transport business, they had made a delivery to a logging camp in these mountains. Margaret had come along because she'd been pregnant with David and Samuel hadn't wanted to leave her. They'd gotten lost, and an old forest guard had found them and led them to safety. "Follow the water," that guard had told them. In these mountains, water flows toward the valleys, and valleys have people. Margaret had never forgotten that advice. She'd never forgotten that guard's kindness. She'd never forgotten that later, when their business had grown beyond Samuel's wildest dreams and he died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her to fight off his greedy relatives, one of the weapons in her legal arsenal had been proving they owned land rights in various regions, including conservation parcels in these very mountains. Land her children knew nothing about. Land that was now, if she remembered correctly, part of a protected corridor she'd quietly helped fund 15 years ago. Margaret walked, her old shoes finding purchase on the soft ground. The light was fading faster now. She needed to find shelter before full darkness. She needed to stay warm. She needed to stay alive. Not for revenge, but for something more important, so they would have to live with what they'd done. The sound of water grew louder. Margaret pushed through a dense stand of bamboo and found herself on the bank of a small river. The water was clear and fast-moving, rushing over smooth stones. On the far side, the forest rose up the mountainside in layers of green and shadow. She knelt carefully, her hip protesting, and drank from her cupped hands. The water was shockingly cold, so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was clean. She drank until her stomach felt heavy, then sat back on a fallen log to rest. The sky above the river was turning from blue to purple. The first stars were appearing. Christmas Eve. Margaret thought about all the Christmas Eves before this one. The ones when her children were small and she'd stayed up late wrapping gifts bought with money from extra shifts. The ones after Samuel died when she'd held them close and promised they'd be okay. The ones after the business grew when she deliberately downplayed her success, living simply, giving generously to charities, keeping the majority of shares hidden under corporate structures and trusts. She'd done it because she'd learned a terrible lesson during the inheritance battle. Money made people into strangers. Samuel's brother, whom they'd trusted, had forged signatures. Samuel's cousin had lied in court. Even the lawyer they'd hired had tried to broker a deal that would have left Margaret with almost nothing. She'd won, but barely. And she'd vowed that her children would never become those people. She would love them simply. Raise them humbly. Make sure they grew into good people before they ever knew the wealth they would inherit. Except somewhere along the way, they'd grown into the very people she'd feared they'd become. And she had missed it. Can you love someone who doesn't deserve it? Comment unconditional or earned. Margaret stood, steadying herself on the log. She needed to keep moving before the cold settled into her bones. She started walking downstream, along the riverbank, keeping the water on her left. The going was slow. Roots reached across her path. Stones shifted under her feet. After 20 minutes, her hip was screaming. After 30, she was breathing hard. But she pushed on because stopping meant death. The forest around her was coming alive with night sounds. Insects. Frogs. The occasional rustle of something larger moving through the undergrowth. Once, she heard something that might have been a leopard's cough, distant but unmistakable. She was not afraid of the leopard. She was afraid of the cold. As full darkness fell, Margaret finally had to stop. Her body simply refused to go further. She found a spot where a large mahogany tree had fallen against a cluster of rocks, creating a small sheltered space underneath. She crawled into it, pulling dead leaves and moss around her for insulation. It smelled of earth and decay, but it was out of the wind. She curled into a ball, the wooden cross pressed against her chest, and closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She knew sleeping in this cold could be her last act. But to pray. Not for rescue. For strength. While Margaret huddled in the forest, miles away in the city, her family was celebrating. The Holloway house was lit up like a jewel box. Colored lights wrapped around every window. A massive Christmas tree dominated the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments and gifts. The air smelled of roasted chicken and spiced wine and chocolate cake. David stood by the fireplace, a whiskey in his hand, watching his children open presents. His son Marcus, 16, was tearing through wrapping paper. His daughter Clara sat apart from everyone, her face pale, her eyes distant. "Clara, open something," Jennifer urged, gesturing to the mountain of gifts. "I'm not hungry," Clara whispered. "I didn't say hungry, I said." "Let her be," David interrupted. He felt strange. "Hello." The whiskey wasn't helping. Peter appeared from the kitchen, his phone pressed to his ear. "I'm telling you, the investment is solid. After the new year, we liquidate Mama's portfolio and fold it into the expansion." He caught David's eye. "Yes, all legal. All transferred. No, she won't be a problem." David turned away. He poured another whiskey. On the television, a news anchor was talking about the unusually cold Christmas Eve, temperatures dropping to near freezing in the mountain regions. David reached for the remote and changed the channel. "You okay?" Jennifer asked, touching his arm. "Fine. You're thinking about her." "I'm not." "David, we did the right thing. She was suffering. The confusion, the pain." "She wasn't confused," Clara said suddenly, her voice loud in the warm room. "At dinner last week, she helped me with my calculus homework. She remembered formulas from 50 years ago. She wasn't confused at all." Silence. Then Jennifer, gently, "Old people have good days and bad days, sweetie." "She had perfect days," Clara insisted, her voice breaking. "Every single day. And we just left her in the—" "Clara, enough." David's voice cracked like a whip. "Your grandmother was ready to go. She said so. She signed the papers. She wanted this. She didn't sign anything." Aunt Jennifer put pills in her tea and then— Jennifer's face went white. "I gave her medicine for her headache. Medicine the doctor prescribed." "What doctor?" Clara demanded. "Show me the prescription." "This is not appropriate Christmas conversation," Peter interjected, pocketing his phone. "Clara, your father and I made a very difficult decision because we love our mother. Because we wanted her to be at peace. She's alone in a forest." Clara shouted. "On Christmas Eve. How is that peace?" Marcus looked up from his new video game. "Wait, what? Grandma's where?" "At a retreat," Jennifer said quickly. "A prayer retreat. Very peaceful. Very spiritual." Clara stood abruptly. "You're all liars." She ran upstairs. They heard her door slam. In the silence that followed, David drained his whiskey. On TV, a choir was singing Silent Night. Through the window, he could see snow beginning to fall, not enough to stick, but enough to make the world look clean and innocent. He thought about his mother's face as she'd stepped out of the car. The way her hands had shaken. The way she'd said please. He poured another drink. 40 miles away, in a modest house on the outskirts of a small mountain town, a man named Thomas Okonkwo was getting ready for his night patrol. Thomas was 53, lean and weathered, with graying hair and eyes that still saw in the dark the way they had when he was a young man learning the forest from his father. He'd been a forest ranger for 30 years, the last 15 as a senior coordinator for the McKenna Mountain Conservation Corridor. Another Christmas Eve patrol, his wife Rose sighed, helping him button his jacket. "Every year I hope they'll give you this one night off." "Poachers don't take Christmas off," Thomas said, kissing her forehead. "Besides, I like the forest on Christmas. It's when it feels most like a church." "You and your poetry." But she smiled. "Be safe. The temperature is dropping." "I know the cold." He picked up his pack, emergency blanket, first aid kit, radio, flashlight, water bottle, energy bars. Then his rifle, not for hunting, but for safety. Leopards, buffalo, the occasional elephant that wandered into the corridor from the national park. He kissed Rose again and headed out to his truck. As he drove up the mountain road, Thomas thought about the corridor and what it meant. 15 years ago, this land had been slated for logging. The company had the permits. The equipment was ready. The local community had been divided, some desperate for the jobs, others desperate to save the forest that fed their streams and sheltered their medicinal plants. Then something unexpected had happened. An anonymous donor had purchased the logging rights and transferred them to a conservation trust. The same donor had funded ranger training for 12 local men, including Thomas. Had paid for ranger stations, equipment, community education programs. Had created jobs that didn't destroy the forest but protected it. Thomas had never met the donor. The lawyers who handled everything said the donor wished to remain anonymous, a wealthy businesswoman from the city who'd been moved by a community letter-writing campaign. But Thomas had seen the signature on one early document, before it had been redacted, M. Holloway. He'd tried to find her once, to thank her. But M. Holloway existed only on paper, a ghost who gave generously and asked for nothing in return. Thomas had given up searching, but he'd never forgotten. He owed his career, his purpose, his pride in his work to a woman he'd never met. Now, as he drove deeper into the forest, he thought about that debt and wondered if he'd ever have the chance to repay it. Margaret was not sleeping. She was too cold to sleep, too aware that sleep might be permanent. So instead she lay in her shelter under the fallen tree, breathing slowly, consciously, trying to conserve her body heat while her mind drifted through decades of memories. She thought about Samuel. How he'd found her working in her mother's market stall, selling vegetables, and had smiled at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. How he'd courted her properly, asking her father's permission, bringing small gifts, never money, always thoughtful things like a book she'd mentioned wanting to read. How he'd built a small transport business with one used truck and a dream, and how she'd done the accounting at night after putting the babies to bed, keeping their books straight while he drove endless routes. How that one truck had become 2, then 5, then 20. How they'd purchased land when no one else saw its value. Parcels near growing towns, near planned highways, near resources that would someday be precious. How Samuel had died at 51, massive heart attack, gone before the ambulance arrived. How his brother had appeared at the funeral with forged documents claiming Samuel had promised him half the business. How the lawyers had descended like vultures, each one claiming to have Samuel's real will. How Margaret, grieving and exhausted, had been pushed to sign settlements that would have left her with almost nothing. But Margaret had not signed. Instead, she'd hired a young lawyer named Patricia Muhindi, who'd taken the case on contingency because she believed Margaret's story. Patricia had proven the forgeries, had traced the real documents, had won everything back. And then Margaret had made a choice. She'd kept 70% of the shares under her own name, hidden behind corporate structures and trusts that her children knew nothing about. She'd given them access to small accounts, modest properties, the cottage she'd moved into, enough that they felt secure but not enough that they felt entitled. She'd planned to reveal everything when they were older, wiser, better. She'd been waiting for them to become good people. But they'd become good liars instead. If you discovered your family only loved you for money, would you forgive them? Comment forgive or walk away. Around midnight, Margaret heard vehicles. Multiple engines, moving slowly up the forest road. Voices. Light beams cutting through the trees. She pulled herself up onto her elbows, every muscle screaming, and crawled to the edge of her shelter. Through the trees, perhaps 200 yards away, she could see lights moving in a coordinated pattern. Searchers. But searching for what? For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Had Clara convinced them to come back? Had one of them developed a conscience? Then she heard the voices more clearly. Check the ravines first. If she wandered off the road, that's where she'd fall. Temperatures below freezing now. If she's not under cover, she's hypothermic already. Boss wants us to do a thorough sweep. Make sure there's no evidence. Margaret's blood turned to ice. They weren't here to rescue her. They were here to make sure she was dead. And to make sure no one would ever know what they'd done. She shrank back into her shelter, her heart hammering. The lights swept through the forest, methodical and thorough. These weren't her children. David and Peter wouldn't risk coming back themselves. These were hired men. Security, maybe, or private investigators. People paid to clean up problems. Margaret made herself small. Made herself still. Made herself invisible the way she'd learned to be invisible for 40 years. The lights passed within 50 yards of her shelter. She heard footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Heard a man say, Nothing here. Let's check downstream. They moved on. But they didn't leave. For 3 hours, Margaret lay perfectly still while the search continued. They were professional. Systematic. They checked the road, the riverbank, the ravines. They used thermal scanners. She saw the red light sweeping across the trees, though thankfully her shelter and the cold earth kept her hidden. Finally, around 3 a.m., she heard engines starting again. No sign of her. Either she's already gone or she made it much further than we thought. Or animals got to her. Yeah. Either way, we're done here. Boss will be satisfied. They left. Margaret waited another 30 minutes, shivering violently now, before she dared to move. When she crawled out of her shelter, her joints had locked up. It took her 10 minutes just to stand. She was not going to survive until morning. She knew that now. The cold had penetrated too deep. Her body was shutting down. But she was not going to die without trying. She started walking again, following the river, every step an act of pure will. She fell twice. The second time, she almost didn't get back up. Then, through the trees ahead, she saw something. A light. Not a flashlight. A steady, warm, electric light. A building. Margaret walked toward it like it was heaven itself. Thomas Okonkwo was making coffee when he heard the sound. A scraping. Like something being dragged across wood. He set down the pot and picked up his flashlight. The ranger station was small, just one room with a desk, a radio, a cot, and a wood stove, but it was his sanctuary on these long night patrols. The scraping came again. At the door. Thomas opened it. At first, he thought the creature on his porch was an injured animal. It was curled in a ball, covered in leaves and dirt, shaking so violently it seemed to vibrate. Then it looked up. A woman. Elderly. Her face so pale it was almost blue. But her eyes were alert and intelligent and utterly exhausted. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. Thomas didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, she weighed almost nothing, and carried her inside. He laid her on the cot, stripped off her wet outer dress, wrapped her in every blanket he had, and then added his own jacket on top. "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" Margaret," she managed. Please. Don't call anyone yet. You need a hospital. You're hypothermic. Please." Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Not yet. They'll find me." Thomas froze. "Who will find you?" But Margaret had closed her eyes. She was unconscious. Thomas worked quickly. He heated water on the stove and made warm compresses for her core, not hot, which could shock her system, but warm. He brewed strong tea. He monitored her breathing, her pulse. After 30 minutes, she opened her eyes. "Still here," she whispered. "Still here," Thomas confirmed. "You're safe. But I need to know what happened. Did someone hurt you?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she told him. Not everything. Not about the money. But about her children driving her into the forest. About being left. About the men who came to make sure she was dead. Thomas listened, his face growing harder with each word. "Your children did this," he said finally. "On Christmas Eve." "Yes." "Why?" "Because they thought I was worth more dead than alive." Thomas stood and paced to the window. Outside, Christmas morning was beginning, the sky turning from black to gray. Inside, a woman who'd nearly been murdered by her own family was wrapped in his blankets. "I should call the police," he said. "No." Margaret sat up slowly. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because I need to handle this my own way." She paused. "Because if I go to the police now, it becomes a scandal. A story. And I've spent 40 years avoiding being a story." "What are you talking about?" Margaret looked at him. "You're Thomas Okonkwo, Senior Ranger. You've been here 15 years. How do you?" "Because I'm the one who paid for your training." Silence. Then Thomas carefully, Holloway. Margaret Holloway. She smiled weakly. "I'm sorry I never introduced myself properly. I preferred to do good quietly. Thomas sat down heavily. You're the donor. You saved this forest. You saved our jobs. I didn't save anything. I just prevented something bad from happening. There's a difference. But why? Because I grew up poor, Thomas. And when I stopped being poor, I remembered what it was like. I remembered who helped me when they had no reason to. I tried to do the same. Thomas shook his head slowly. Your children don't know any of this. No. I kept it from them. I thought. She trailed off. I thought if they didn't know about the money, they would love me for the right reasons. Turns out they just thought I was worthless. What do you want to do? Margaret thought about that. What did she want? Revenge. Justice. Reconciliation. No. She wanted them to understand. To really, truly understand what they'd done. Not just that they'd tried to kill her, but who they'd become in order to do it. I want to go home, she said finally. But first, I need to make some phone calls. David woke on Christmas morning with a headache and a sense of dread he couldn't name. Downstairs, the house was silent. The Christmas lights looked garish in the gray morning light. Wrapping paper littered the floor. The roasted chicken sat congealed on the counter, barely touched. He made coffee and tried not to think about his mother. He was failing. At 9 a.m., Peter called. Did the security team report back? Yeah. Nothing. She's gone. Good. That's good. Neither of them said what gone meant. Jennifer wants us to have a memorial, David said. She thinks it will look better. Like we cared. When? New Year's Eve. Small service. Some of Mama's church friends. The ones who think she was poor. All of them thought she was poor, Peter. A pause. Then, do you think we're going to hell for this? David hung up. At noon, Clara came downstairs. She looked like she hadn't slept. I'm calling the police, she announced. No, you're not, Jennifer said firmly. Grandma is dead because of you. Your grandmother died peacefully in a prayer retreat, Jennifer said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who's told a lie so many times she believes it. She wanted it that way. There was no retreat. Clara, David interjected tiredly, you're 16. You don't understand the complexity of adult decisions. I understand murder. It wasn't murder. It was mercy. Then why don't you tell the police that? David had no answer. Clara picked up her phone. I'm calling. Jennifer moved to take it from her, but before she could, the doorbell rang. They all froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Marcus yelled from upstairs, "Someone's at the door!" David went to answer it, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. On the porch stood a woman in an expensive suit, holding a leather briefcase. Behind her was a man in a police uniform. "David Holloway?" the woman asked. "Yes. I'm Patricia Mohindi, senior partner at Mohindi and Associates. This is Officer Kamani. May we come in?" David's mouth went dry. "What's this about?" "Your mother." They sat in the living room, David, Peter, Jennifer, and Clara, facing Patricia Mohindi and Officer Kamani. The Christmas tree lights blinked cheerfully in the corner. On TV, a choir sang "Joy to the World." Patricia opened her briefcase. "Let me start by saying that Margaret Holloway is alive." Jennifer gasped. Peter went white. David just stared. Clara burst into tears. "Where?" Clara demanded. "Where is she? Is she okay?" "She's recovering," Officer Kamani said. "She was found by a forest ranger suffering from severe hypothermia. She's now receiving medical care." "Thank God," David breathed. "We've been so worried. She wandered away from the retreat and—" "There was no retreat," Patricia interrupted coldly. "Don't insult my intelligence or waste my time with lies, Mr. Holloway. Your mother has told us everything." Silence. Then Peter, "Whatever she said, she's confused. She's been having memory problems." "Her memory is perfect," Patricia said. "She remembers you drugging her tea. She remembers you forging her signature on transfer documents. She remembers you driving her into the forest and abandoning her to die. She remembers the security team you sent to make sure she didn't survive. That's insane, Jennifer whispered. Why would we do that? Patricia smiled without warmth. For the cottage deed, the savings account, the small jewelry collection. Shall I continue? David's voice was barely audible. Those were her only assets. No, Patricia said. Those were the only assets she allowed you to know about. She pulled out a document and placed it on the coffee table. This is Margaret Holloway's real portfolio. She is the majority shareholder in Holloway Logistics and Land Development, which is currently valued at approximately $800 million. She owns properties in 7 countries. She has funded over 40 charitable organizations, including the Forest Conservation Program that saved her life. She has investments in technology, pharmaceuticals, and sustainable energy. The room tilted. Peter leaned forward. That's not possible. Mama lived like a poor woman. She was a poor woman. Your mother lived humbly by choice. She chose to see if you would love her without money. You failed that test spectacularly. If she was rich, David said slowly, trying to process, why didn't she tell us? Because she'd learned what money does to people, Patricia said. She learned it when your father died and his family tried to steal everything. She learned it again watching you grow more entitled, more cruel, more interested in her possessions than her well-being. She was waiting for you to become good people before she gave you anything. We are good people, Jennifer protested. You tried to murder her. We thought it was mercy. You thought it was convenient, Officer Kamani corrected. Clara was crying openly now. Can I see her? Please. I tried to stop them, I swear I did. Your grandmother knows that, Patricia said gently. She saw you crying in the car. She heard you defend her. Then she knows I didn't. She knows. Patricia looked at David, Peter, and Jennifer. What happens next is your mother's decision. She can press charges. Attempted murder. Fraud. Elder abuse. You would all go to prison. Or, Peter asked, or you can accept her terms. Margaret's terms were delivered in a letter, which Patricia read aloud. To my children, I am alive. I am safe. I am also done. You will return everything you took from me, every document you forged, every signature you faked, every asset you stole. If I find a single discrepancy, I will prosecute. You will never contact me again. No calls. No letters. No attempts at reconciliation. I am removing you from my life as cleanly as you tried to remove me from yours. Clara is exempted from this. She is young enough to still grow. She tried to save me. That matters. As for my estate, you will inherit nothing. Everything will go to the organizations and people who showed me the kindness you couldn't. You wanted me gone so you could take what was mine. Now I'm gone by choice, and you get nothing. Do not look for me. Do not speak my name. I am finished with all of you. Margaret Holloway. Silence. Then Jennifer, her voice shaking, she can't do this. We're her children. We're family. Family doesn't abandon each other in forests, Patricia said. Sign these documents returning her assets, or I call the prosecutor. Your choice. They signed. As Patricia and Officer Kamani left, Clara ran after them. Please. Please tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I love her. Patricia softened. She knows, sweetheart. She asked me to give you this. She handed Clara an envelope. Inside was a letter and a bank routing number. Clara. You tried. That's more than they did. You're welcome to visit me when you turn 18. Until then, I've set up an account for your education. Make something good of your life. Love. Grandma. Clara clutched the letter and sobbed. Inside, David sat in his living room, surrounded by Christmas decorations and unopened gifts, and finally understood what he'd lost. Not money. His mother. If you were Margaret, would you give them a second chance? Comment mercy or justice. 6 months later, in a small coastal town 300 miles away, Margaret Holloway sat on her veranda watching the ocean. She'd bought a modest house with a garden. She volunteered at the local library. She'd joined a church where no one knew her history. She was simply Margaret, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Thomas Okonkwo visited monthly. They'd become friends, bound by the night that had changed everything. He'd told her the forest missed her, even though she'd never walked it in daylight. Clara visited too, on weekends when she could get away. They didn't talk about David or Peter or Jennifer. They talked about Clara's grades, her dreams, her boyfriend. They talked about the future. One evening, as the sun set over the water, Clara asked the question she'd been holding for months. "Do you miss them at all?" Margaret thought about it. "I miss who I wanted them to be. I don't miss who they actually are." "Do you think they've changed?" "I don't know. I hope so. But it's not my responsibility anymore." "Did you ever love them?" "Oh, sweetheart." Margaret took Clara's hand. "I loved them more than anything. That's why it hurt so much. That's why I had to walk away." "Was it worth it?" Clara asked quietly. "All those years of hiding who you were. Did it teach them anything?" Margaret watched the waves for a long moment. "It taught them who they really are," she said finally. "And it taught me that love isn't about what you give people. It's about who they become because of how you love them." "I loved them the best way I knew how. They became people who would leave an old woman to die for money they didn't even know existed." "That's so sad." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "But you know what's not sad? That I survived. That I get to sit here with you. That I get to watch the ocean and feed the birds and know that when I die, really die, when I'm ready, I'll do it with dignity. Not in a forest, abandoned and afraid, but in my own home, surrounded by people who chose to love me." Clara leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. "I choose to love you," she whispered. "I know," Margaret said. "You proved it." They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in the city, Margaret's former children were living with their choices. But here, in this moment, Margaret was free. She had been abandoned in a forest on Christmas Eve by the people who should have loved her most. But she had survived. Not because of money. Not because of power. But because decades ago, she had planted seeds of kindness in unexpected places. She had helped a young lawyer who had no reason to believe her. She had funded a forest program that created a network of rangers who knew every inch of the mountains. She had lived a life where her character, not her wealth, defined her. And in the end, it was her character that saved her. Money hadn't saved her. Character had. And that made all the difference. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is the truth about themselves. Sometimes the greatest love is walking away. Sometimes survival isn't about being strong. It's about having lived a life worth saving. Merry Christmas. May you be loved for who you are, not what you have.